In 1979, Carol Henderson, a 29-year-old radio DJ, vanished while heading to her late-night shift at KZMR radio station, leaving behind only dead air and an abandoned car with keys still in the ignition. But 14 years later, construction workers demolishing the old radio tower made a horrifying discovery, revealing a truth more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the converted warehouse studio, where podcasting equipment hummed softly in the dim light. Brittany Henderson, 29, adjusted her headphones and leaned into the microphone, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who'd spent years perfecting her craft. Welcome back to Cold Frequencies, where we dive deep into the cases that refuse to stay buried. She paused, glancing at the framed photograph beside her computer. A woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, frozen in time at the exact same age Brittany was now. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd built her career as a true crime podcaster, investigating the very mystery that had defined her life, her mother's disappearance. After years of searching from afar, she'd finally returned to her hometown of Evanston, driven by a need to walk the same streets, to feel closer to the mother she'd lost when she was just 15. Carol Henderson had been Evanston's voice in the darkness, hosting Midnight Grooves from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. at KZMR radio station. KZMR had been broadcasting from a temporary tower for months, while construction crews worked on their new permanent transmission facility. The old tower had been damaged in a storm earlier that year, and the station was eager to complete the upgraded structure before winter. Carol had been hosting Midnight Grooves from the temporary setup, but everyone was looking forward to the improved signal strength the new tower would provide. On Tuesday evening, August 14, 1979, she kissed her daughter goodbye and told the babysitter she'd be back by 3 a.m., as usual. It was routine. Carol had made this same journey hundreds of times before, driving the familiar route from her apartment to the radio station on Baker Street. But that night, Carol never made it to her shift. For 4 hours, dead air filled the airwaves while loyal listeners waited for her familiar voice. When the morning crew arrived at 6 a.m., they found her blue Chevy Nova in the station parking lot, keys dangling from the ignition. The driver's side door was ajar, as if she'd stepped out intending to return momentarily. The police investigation that followed was thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Carol had no enemies, no financial troubles, no history of mental illness. She was a devoted single mother who'd never shown any signs of wanting to disappear. The case grew cold as weeks turned to months, and eventually the file was relegated to a dusty shelf in the basement of the Evanston Police Department. Detective Ray Brown had worked the Henderson case with the dedication of a man who understood that every missing person represented a family torn apart. He interviewed Carol's co-workers at the radio station, her neighbors, her friends from high school. The station manager, Jim Collins, spoke of Carol as a consummate professional who never missed a shift. The overnight security guard, Pete Martinez, confirmed seeing her car arrive most nights around 9:45 p.m. The audio engineer, Larry Wilson, had been particularly helpful during the investigation. A quiet man in his mid-30s who'd worked at KZMR for nearly 5 years, he'd stayed late that Tuesday night to help search for Carol when she failed to show up. Larry had even volunteered to cover some of her shifts in the weeks following her disappearance, stepping behind the microphone with a nervous but earnest voice to keep Midnight Grooves on the air. As months passed, the investigation stalled. There were no witnesses, no evidence of foul play, no leads that didn't eventually dead end. Carol Henderson had simply vanished into the night, leaving behind a 15-year-old daughter and a community of listeners who mourned the loss of their midnight companion. By 1993, KZMR had moved to a new facility across town, and the old radio tower that had broadcast Carol's voice into the darkness was scheduled for demolition. The broadcasting technology had evolved, and the aging concrete structure had become obsolete. The demolition crew arrived on a crisp morning in March, their heavy machinery ready to tear down what had once been the heart of Evanston's airwaves. Brittany Henderson, now 29 and working as a freelance journalist in Chicago, had built her career around the questions that had haunted her childhood. She'd started Cold Frequencies as a way to process her own trauma while helping other families find closure. The podcast had gained a devoted following, but Brittany had always avoided covering her mother's case directly. The wound was still too fresh, too personal. The construction foreman, Mike Rodriguez, had been working demolition for 20 years, but he'd never seen anything like what they uncovered that March morning. As the jackhammers broke through the foundation's concrete, something that definitely wasn't rebar caught his eye. "Stop the machines!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the construction site. Wrapped in what appeared to be old radio station promotional materials were unmistakable human remains. The skeleton was largely intact, positioned as if the person had been carefully placed rather than hastily buried. Alongside the bones, investigators found a tarnished gold bracelet, a pair of small diamond earrings, and most chilling of all, the rusted remains of an old studio microphone. The discovery sent shockwaves through Evanston. After 14 years of questions, Carol Henderson had been found, but the location of her remains raised disturbing new questions. According to construction records, the radio tower's foundation had been poured in October 1979, 2 months after Carol's disappearance. The timing suddenly made horrifying sense. Detective Brown, now nearing retirement, reopened the case with fresh eyes and new technology. The revelation that Carol's body had been placed in the foundation during construction meant her killer had not only planned her murder but had intimate knowledge of the tower's construction schedule. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was calculated, premeditated. The investigation quickly focused on station employees who would have had access to construction information. Larry Wilson's name surfaced almost immediately. Co-workers described him as a solitary man who'd always seemed to have a particular interest in Carol's show. He would often linger in the booth during her broadcasts, ostensibly to check audio levels, but staying far longer than necessary. When detectives searched Larry's apartment, they found a disturbing shrine to Carol Henderson. Photographs taken without her knowledge lined his bedroom walls. Audio recordings of her voice, edited together to create fictional conversations, filled dozens of cassette tapes. A detailed journal chronicled his growing obsession, describing fantasies of being with Carol and rage at her perceived rejection of his advances. The final entry, dated August 13, 1979, contained chilling details about the construction schedule and his plan to ensure Carol would never leave him again. The complete truth was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. Larry Wilson hadn't just killed Carol Henderson, he'd orchestrated an elaborate plan to make her disappear permanently. Using his position as the station's audio engineer, he'd gained access to construction schedules and had gone over the plans and discovered a hollow space in the foundation where he could hide her body. On the night of August 14th, Larry had approached Carol in the parking lot under the pretense of discussing a technical issue with her microphone. When she'd stepped out of her car, he'd attacked her with a piece of audio equipment, the very microphone found with her remains. The murder had been quick, but the cover-up had been methodical. Larry had stored Carol's body in a hidden location for 2 months, waiting for the perfect moment. When the new tower's foundation was ready to be poured in October, he wrapped her body in the station's promotional materials and placed her in the hollow space within the foundation. The next morning, when the concrete pour was completed, any evidence of his crime was sealed beneath tons of concrete. For 14 years, KZMR had broadcast from directly above Carol's grave, with her killer working just feet away from where he'd hidden her body. The most disturbing revelation came from Larry's journal. He'd continued his obsession even after Carol's death, believing that by preserving her body within the radio tower, he'd somehow made her a permanent part of the station she'd loved. Larry Wilson was arrested in 1993 at his new job at a radio station in a neighboring state. He'd spent 14 years believing his crime was perfect, never imagining that progress and renovation would eventually expose his secret. During questioning, he showed no remorse, instead expressing anger that his shrine to Carol had been disturbed. Brittany returned to Evanston for the first time since her mother's funeral. Standing in the empty lot where the radio tower had once stood, she felt a complex mixture of closure and devastation. The truth had finally emerged, but it was darker than anything she'd imagined during those years of wondering and hoping. In the final episode of Cold Frequencies dedicated to her mother's case, Brittany spoke directly to her listeners. For 14 years, I believed my mother had simply vanished into the night. The truth is that she was there all along, hidden in plain sight by someone she trusted. Larry Wilson stole not just her life, but our ability to properly mourn her. But he couldn't steal her voice. It lives on in every story we tell, every case we solve, every family we help find closure. The case of Carol Henderson became a cautionary tale about the hidden darkness that can lurk behind familiar faces. Her daughter's podcast continued, now with a deeper understanding of how evil can hide in the most ordinary places, and how the truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of eventually surfacing. The old radio tower was gone, but Carol's voice and her story would never be silenced again.